Hello, and welcome to another episode of 4 for 4 is the most accurate podcast. My name is John Paulsen. John Daigle has the day off because today we have one of my favorite guests on to do our 5th annual deep dive into the wide receiver position. He is Matt Harmon of Yahoo Sports. He also has his own website, Reception Perception, where he charts route running to excruciating detail. If you want to take your receiver knowledge to the next level, be sure to subscribe to his site. You can also find him on Twitter, X, whatever we're calling it, at Matt Harmon _BYB. Welcome back, Matt.
Excruciating detail is certainly the way to say it. I appreciate this, John. Glad we are able to get it in here. Maybe a little bit later than usual. That's probably on me. But real life, sometimes it happens. But I'm excited to be here to talk about this. I think the receiver position this year, we say it every year that there's so many good players, there's so many good guys, but I think, especially in fantasy, like how to crack it this year, I think is a really fun challenge. So I'm excited to talk about it.
Yeah, we were actually going to have you on a couple of weeks earlier. You said you had a few more charting folks to wrap up and add to the database. So I want as many players in the database as we could when I start to crunch my numbers, which I'll get into in a minute. So we decided to do it this week, August 9th. So just a quick business note, we've partnered with Sleeper to offer a free 4 for 4 pro subscription just for depositing $20 in their picks game. If you get to a 100% match up to $100 as well. Current and new Sleeper accounts are eligible as long as they haven't deposited into the picks game yet. So you can get a free 4 for 4 sub that way. We've also partnered with Vivid Picks and BetMGM to offer free subs. Just hit the subscribe button in the top right of the site to find out more. You can also get 10% off any 4 for 4 subscription with the code Paulsen. That's SEN, spelled the correct way. Paulsen 10. All right, we're going to jump right in. I'm not going to ask Matt to give the listeners a overview of reception perception process. I'm going to try to link to a previous episode for that, for those that are interested in that. But let's just trust that his process is good. It's been a number of years now that he's been refining it. And one note here, I'm going to be mentioning my one number rankings where I have compiled Matt's perception data into one number so I can quickly see how a player did in Matt's charting in any particular year. I like to use this to sort of see players that maybe didn't score a lot of fantasy points, but did well in his success rates. Maybe these are emerging players. Also like to see what players are going, how they're doing from year to year. So I don't publish a full rankings out of respect for Matt's work, but it's a good reference. We've always discussed it on the podcast. So I think it's fair game right now. There are 49 players in the sample for now. We're missing Tyreek Hill, which we know he's awesome.
We did go live this morning, actually.
Oh, so. I missed him in my data, but I'm sure he did quite well. Actually, yes. One of the poster childs for the reception perception process. He did a few years ago. He was going in the 5th round, and Matt identified that he was a very good route runner at that point, and he ended up finishing very high that year. I remember getting him in the 5th round that year on your data. So there are 49 players in the sample. I just wanted to briefly discuss the top 10. We've got some familiar names. I'm sure when you start to chart Stephon Diggs and Justin Jefferson and Cooper Kupp, it's just like, okay, these guys are awesome. These aren't the most interesting. They're obviously awesome route runners, so maybe not the most interesting charting processes for you to do because you're not like unearthing some mystery. Devontae Adams, AJ Brown, and Chris Olave actually popped in the top 10 as well. But one guy I wanted to ask, we're going to talk about Olave in a little bit, but one guy I wanted to ask about immediately because I'm kind of torn on him because of the year and a half off, which is Calvin Ridley. You charted his 2021 sample. He's our underdog featured player of the day. ADP's been bopping around a little bit here with a toe injury that he picked up in camp. He was number 10 in the one number rankings. This is from the 2021 charting. He's wide receiver 15 off the board, pick 28 at underdog. I'm going to give the brief spiel and you tell me why you think you like him or don't like him this year. I think you're probably going to like him. 28-year-old. So age shouldn't be an issue. Missed the last season and a half. There was no injury here to keep him out. So that's the difference between him and, say, Michael Thomas. It wasn't an injury that kept him out. It was a mental issue. He wanted to step away for mental health issues. And then he got dinged for a full season suspension. So physically, he should be just fine. He is dealing with that toe injury, as I mentioned. He was a reception perception favorite heading into 2021. How do you think his production is going to carry over? Route running should be fine carrying over. I worry a little bit about the rust, but he is getting an upgrade at quarterback now. I guess it's Matt Ryan before, and now it's Trevor Lawrence, but it's certainly better than Desmond Ridder. And a crowded receiving core there with Christian Kirk, Zay Jones, Evan Ingram there in Jacksonville.
Yeah. Look, I mean, by the way, just about the top guys, I wouldn't say they're the not fun guys to chart, maybe to write up. It's like, could I just maybe instead of the 500, 700 word profile that I usually give people, can I just write, yep, very, very good. Thumbs up. Let's keep moving. The more rough guys to chart is like 2 games in. You're like, ooh, this is not going to be good, but I got to get through 6 more because that's the process. But Calvin Ridley is one of those really fun players to chart, and I'm glad I included him in this in the database this year because I wanted to remind people, what type of player he was. And like you said, number 10 in the one number rankings because, man, this guy – such a good player. And you mentioned in the early portions of his reception perception career, 2018, 2019, he was very much looking like a Stephon Diggs type of player. And I think that's who he was in 2020. He had that type of season from a production standpoint. He did a lot of the damage too when Julio Jones was out. And as reception perception showed, 76% success rate versus man, 81.4% success rate versus zone, and 75.6% success rate versus press, while being doubled on 6.8% of his routes. That, I think, is a relatively high number. And obviously when Jones was out, that's when that number started to jump up. I think the common thought was, he had a kind of a down season in 2021 when he was out there. But that's why I wanted to go back and include this profile, because all those 3 success rates I just read off from 2020, when you look at his 2021 5-game sample, 76.4% success rate versus man, 80.5% success rate versus zone, and 75% success rate versus press. He was basically that same guy. I think he had already emerged as like a true number 1, top 10 in the NFL type of receiver. He actually was thrown into a lot of contested situations in that 5-game sample, and I kind of wish I had thought to myself, I wonder why this guy who's open all the time is being thrown into contested situations. Maybe it's because the quarterback play is the quarterback's arm is starting to decline. We'll put a pin in that when we get back to Michael Pittman at some point later in the show. So for Calvin Ridley, I think from a talent perspective, I don't have any problems. I think he is exactly what Trevor Lawrence needs. You watch that Jaguars offense last year. All year long, you're thinking they need a true number 1 receiver on the outside that can beat press man coverage. That is Calvin Ridley. He has that type of ability to be, like I said, a Stephon Diggs light type of player. And I don't know, John, I think the offense is crowded, but I think they can be a very concentrated unit, much like the Eagles were last year. Like when they were throwing the ball to A.J. Brown, Devontae Smith, Dallas Goedert, and that was it. I think the Jaguars, they're going to throw the ball to, and they sprinkle in Quez Watkins. I think the Jags are going to sprinkle in Zay Jones, but it's mostly going to be Ridley, Kirk, and Evan Ingram. So I like them to be that type of offense this year, very concentrated, and I like Calvin Ridley. Look, I said when the trade first went down, I wanted to be cautiously optimistic about Calvin Ridley. I've thrown caution to the wind. I have him ranked as my wide receiver 13 this year. I think he's my guy that I want people to draft.
That was my follow-up question because I'm looking at the 3rd round of drafts, and that's where I see perceived drop-off in talent, or just comparing them to the 4th, 5th rounders that are available. There isn't a big disparity for me between some of these receivers, some of these running backs, and the guys you can get a little bit later. And we're going to talk about a few of those guys we can get later. But so Calvin Ridley was sitting there in the middle to the late 3rd round. Is he, somebody that I want to target? I loved him prior to this, departure from the NFL suspension. But, you're looking at these receivers going after him. DK Metcalf, not crazy about him at wide receiver 16. Amari Cooper getting a little bit older. We got a weird quarterback situation going on there. Debo's pretty solid. But, there's some 4th, 5th, 6th round receivers we're going to talk about that, maybe this is where I'm drafting a top 3 quarterback, or maybe this is where I'm drafting Mark Andrews. So how do you compare Ridley to maybe switching up and going with one of those other positions?
Yeah, look, I think I would just take Ridley because I think imagine this, like live in this pretend world where we were like the two worlds were combined here. Like Calvin Ridley had not spent any time away from football. We're talking about the player that was in 2020 and 2021, and that player was intersecting with Trevor Lawrence. I think you would rank that guy where you're ranking Garrett Wilson, where you're ranking Amon-Ra St. Brown. So even having him at 13, which is aggressive, is still below where I think he would be if all things were equal. So I get all things are not equal, but again, that's the talent I think he is. Like, I think he's that type of player, and I think Trevor Lawrence is that type of quarterback.
All right, let's move on to a section that I've got listed as my primary middle round targets. I just dropped my draft day strategy this week, and these are the 3 receivers that I want. And I think that these guys represent the best values on the board at the position, especially as you get in the middle rounds. So, and we're going to just talk about them as a group. Deontay Johnson, wide receiver 31 ADP, number 6 in the 1 number rankings. Tyler Lockett, wide receiver 30, number 3 in the 1 number rankings. And then Terry McLaurin, a little maybe going off the board more reasonably because he's number 21 in the 1 number rankings, but he's been a reception perception favorite for a few years now. He's really improved his route running. His ADP is wide receiver 24. So what I've been telling my followers and subscribers is that you could pretty easily get McLaurin in the 4th, either Deontay or Tyler Lockett in the 5th, depending on your site's ADP and who might go first, and then turn around in the 6th round and get Deontay or Tyler Lockett in the 6th round. And those are your 3 receivers. Maybe you add a stud receiver at the start of the draft, and that's your four-man group. But this is really good value here in this 4th to 6th round compared to some of those guys going maybe in the 3rd round, 2nd round.
Yeah, I think McLaurin, only reason he's a little lower this year in like the 1 number rankings is, he has a lower success rate versus man this year than in his previous 3 years, but it's still a really good number. He's still a really good player. We've seen him reach like 97th, 96th percentile type numbers in reception perception the 2 years prior. And really last year they had him running out as like a pure X receiver and was never moving. You look at him last year for his sampled snaps, he was outside on 83.4% of his sampled snaps. It was on the line for 94.6%. Like, there was no pre-snap motion. The other guys were kind of the movement players. I think they'll be a little bit better about that with McLaurin this year. But yeah, look, I mean, you're not going to be surprised that I'm going to rubber stamp all those players as very good. Deontay Johnson, I think, he's kind of like the weirdest good player of all time. He has like no touchdowns last year, but he has 2 2-point conversions. The yards per target's always really low because of the 2-point conversions. Give me a break. I'm really interested, John, in the Steelers offense this year. I've never been a big fan of Matt Canada's route combinations. I think like the go routes and hitch route, like basic route combinations that they have, you're really drawn dead against like cover 2 and 2 high defenses. Like, just think about it from a structural perspective, like where you're coming back into those zones, like where you're running into the zone on the go route. It's just not very efficient for modern NFL offenses to face off against modern NFL defenses. Would have been good like in 16-15 when there was a lot more man coverage out there. So I know it's like kind of high level, nerdy football stuff, but it does matter from the efficiency part from a fantasy perspective. And I think when you look at the way that this offense finished, I think they were starting to mix up Deontay's route combinations a little bit, like getting him on some more outbreaking stuff. George Pickens, can he take a step in like the intermediate short area? Are they going to cut back his amount of go routes? I think Allen Robinson, nobody wants to hear it, is going to be a fun fit as their slot receiver, much more than he was as the Rams X receiver. He can't play that role anymore, but maybe he can play this role. I like Pat Freiermuth, and I kind of think Kenny Pickett can take a step. So I think Deontay Johnson's a screaming value where he's going right now. I like this offense and how it's set up at this point.
Yeah, I would hope that Pickett has some upside. He had, I think, 7 passing touchdowns last year. That was a big problem for the Steelers offense. McLaurin, I'm interested in Sam Howell. I think that there's some upside there. He had a 31.6 target share in that one game that Howell played. Deontay, I believe the stat 142 to 152. There's 50 receivers since 2010 that have had that many targets, and they have averaged 7.3 touchdowns per game. If he had, or per year, and if he had just kept his touchdown rate prior to last year, he would have scored 7.3 touchdowns last year. So a lot of touchdown upside. If Pickett can just be average, I think Deontay takes off. And then Tyler Lockett is an interesting case because we've been talking about him on this podcast, on the deep dive for years and years and years. And he just always seems to outproduce his draft position. Last year, he was wide receiver 13 in scoring, and he's going off the board wide receiver 30. They did add, obviously, Jackson Smith and Jigba, which I think everybody is saying is going to take, with his ADP, is going to take targets away from Lockett. But I don't think that he's just going to go away. I think, wide receiver 30 is still a steal for Tyler Lockett. Anything you want to say about Lockett?
I mean, what are we doing here with Tyler Lockett? Like, last year, it's funny. There's several receivers that have been great in the last decade that I think you're starting to see the signs of decline. I mentioned Allen Robinson. I think there are signs of decline there. Obviously, I think with Keenan Allen, there have been signs of decline there. DeAndre Hopkins, some small signs of decline. Like, is he kind of reaching that point? Lockett's around the same age of all these guys, but there was no signs. Like, I could see this fear if there was some, okay, the scoring was good, but maybe he didn't look the same. He had the best success rate versus man coverage of his entire career last year, 96th percentile in reception perception history, was great against press, was great against zone, was great at all three levels. I don't look, if you want to say that Jackson Smith and Jigba is going to come in here and take from one of these two receivers, it can just as easily be DK Metcalf as it can for Tyler Lockett, who I think Tyler Lockett's been, and I love DK Metcalf. I'm a DK Metcalf fan, but you can make the argument that Lockett's been the better receiver there the last 3 years. And I think, really, John, it just comes down to, I think that Geno Smith's performance last year was stable. I think this offense is going to kick ass this year, man. I really think my answer is you can draft Lockett, absolutely. You can also draft Metcalf where he's going, and I think you can take Jackson Smith and Jigba where he's going. Like, I just want to be in on all of these Seahawks receivers, but Lockett is for sure, I think, the screaming value of the three.
And the easiest way to buy in is to get Geno Smith. He's available so late. And you now have rolled out quarterback profiles. Derek at Reception Perception, Derek Klassen. I wanted to see what he thought of Geno Smith, and basically he said he does not think it's a flash in the pan his season last year. So that bodes well for this entire offense, including Tyler Lockett, my favorite.
Among the guys that Derek has on the site right now, Geno Smith is number one in success rate, which is basically like an accuracy measure, success rate against throwing against man coverage. So that lines up well for a man beater in Tyler Lockett, a man beater in DK Metcalf, and a guy in Jackson Smith and Jigba, I think, from the slot can beat man coverage.
Yeah, for those that want to go late round quarterback, it's still alive in the form of Geno Smith, maybe Daniel Jones. But Geno Smith's got a great receiving core. All right, so let's move on to a few other middle round values. I wanted to ask you about Michael Pittman. I'm looking at Michael Pittman, I'm looking at Drake London, I'm looking at DJ Moore, and I'm looking at Marquise Brown. These guys all have quarterback issues. Some of them are being dinged for their quarterback issues more than others. Michael Pittman finished fantasy-wise wide receiver 23 last year. He's the wide receiver 34 off the board. He has turned in back-to-back seasons in the top 8 in the one-number rankings and success rate. We think he's really good. But can he survive Anthony Richardson at quarterback? What are the pluses and minuses here?
So I think you're right. Michael Pittman, very good player. Like I mentioned earlier, watching Calvin Ridley in 2021, going back and charting that season, like the signs were definitely there that Matt Ryan's arm was starting to fall off. And then it completely fell off in Indianapolis, unfortunately. And I think when you look at Michael Pittman, though, like you said, 95th percentile success rate versus press. He's really good in the one number rankings. Like, I think he's got all the chops to be a true number one receiver. I love the way they use him on these like routes over the middle, dig routes, slant routes, curl routes. He's going to, and I think the marriage of those routes where he's really good, and Pittman separates all over the field. He's maybe not the best vertical separator, but he can win combative jump balls down there, which we saw with Carson Wentz in 2021. It's like we had the one quarterback that would get Michael Pittman the ball on these deep contested routes, and the one who could only get him the ball on like 6-yard in routes. Can we get someone to meet him in the middle? Can Anthony Richardson be the guy to meet him in the middle? But with those routes that they have Pittman run a lot, and the routes that I think he's really successful, kind of in like a Keenan Allen type of way, winning those routes over the middle, this is going to be an RPO-heavy offense. And the research done by Ben Gretch and JJ Zacharyson on like how targets can funnel to one guy on these like RPO heavy offenses, and that can help offset some of the concerns about a mobile quarterback and even a rookie mobile quarterback. Michael Pittman dominated first read targets according to Fantasy Points data last year, and I think we know why, right? He's really good. He's always getting open. So I think he can survive there. I think if Richardson is good, there's a lot of upside at a very low draft value. So I've been consistently ranking Michael Pittman ahead of consensus because, look, I get the risk there that they're going to be very run heavy, but I think if one guy is going to be able to overcome it, and I kind of like this receiver core generally, I think it's going to be Michael Pittman though.
This is like prime usage of the reception perception for fantasy, is to identify a player like this who is a really, really good route runner and is getting better and yet is going this late in drafts. I mean, you're able to get him 7th round as your wide receiver 3 or wide receiver 4. And to have this young, talented player available at that point, I mean, it's weird to see him and Mike Evans, going that late together. Godwin's going a little bit earlier, but they all have quarterback problems. All right, so you spoke to Michael Pittman. We have reasons to be optimistic due to the offense and how it could funnel to one player, so that's good. Now, Drake London has an issue, which is a quarterback issue as well. Maybe Desmond Ridder is better than Anthony Richardson. I don't know. I just wanted to mention Anthony Richardson. I think his deep ball accuracy was actually really good, so that might play into the Alec Pierce and also the Michael Pittman contested catches downfield. I just wanted to mention that. But Drake London, wide receiver 25 ADP. He finished wide receiver 38 last year. So this is almost a flip of what Pittman did last year and where they're being ranked, drafted now. So I just find this whole thing odd. Can he survive? I mean, he obviously did very well in your charting, number 15 in the one number rankings, not as well as Pittman, but really well. Can he survive Desmond Ridder, Arthur Smith, and the return of Kyle Pitts?
Pretty fun player, and actually kind of similar players, I think, a little bit with Michael Pittman, where they're these big receivers, but they're really underrated separators, especially underneath. Like you look at some of those routes we were talking about for Michael Pittman with Drake London, by the way, 2 USC products as well. 82.4% success rate versus slant on slant routes, 81.8 on curls, 80% digs. But then the really interesting stuff with Drake London is I do think he's a great vertical receiver as well. 63.2% success rate on 9 routes, 88.2% success rate on post routes. And we know that one thing that this offense wants to do, and I know this is like the worst thing any fantasy analyst can say, but I really like Arthur Smith's offense. I really like the way they design passing plays. I like the route combinations. I get it. Like people are pissed at the way things went for Kyle Pitts last year. That's kind of a separate thing. But I like the way that they design offenses. The offense there in Tennessee, coming from Tennessee to Atlanta, I've always liked Arthur Smith's route combinations and the way he uses play action to get these guys big shot plays down the field. Really what we're asking from Desmond Ridder here is to just be functional. And like if you look at that 21 Falcons offense, again, Matt Ryan I think was in decline, but Matt Ryan averaged like 33 pass attempts per game that year. I know it was like down at 24 with Marcus Mariota, but we have to remember that Marcus Mariota, not only is he a scrambler, he also takes a bunch of sacks too. And that kills your passing volume overall when you have those two combinations and a coach that wants to run the ball a little bit. But Ridder was up around like 28 pass attempts per game. And I think they could even get up to that like 29-30 number if they're confident in Ridder. And by all indications, they're confident in Ridder. I don't have like a strong Desmond Ridder take. All I know is we're just asking him to be functional. And I think if he's functional, then we could see Drake London have like an A.J. Brown second year type of year in this offense.
Yeah, they did throw the ball a little bit more with Ridder, but it wasn't much. And I'm looking at his deep ball adjusted accuracy at PFF, and he's 62nd out of 78 with a 20% adjusted deep ball accuracy, which is something I look at when expecting. Yeah, so I'm worried. And what I'm getting at is that Pittman's being dinged for it in terms probably like, if he finished wide receiver 23 last year and he's going wide receiver 35, he's getting dinged 12 spots, yet London is going 13 spots earlier. So that disconnects for me. And there's another couple of guys, Marquise Brown and DJ Moore. Marquise Brown definitely has quarterback questions. That could be alleviated quickly if Kyler Murray is able to come back and play early in the season. DJ Moore has a major quarterback issue. I mean, Justin Fields was objectively bad at throwing the ball as good as he was running the ball and being a fantasy player. He was objectively bad throwing the ball. And I think Football Outsiders came out with a stat about, quarterbacks that were negative DVOA or whatever for the first 2 seasons. They don't, there's like 1 out of a million that have bounced back and been good. So it's interesting to see It's interesting to see the faith in DJ Moore, the lack of faith in Marquise Brown, the faith in Drake London, and the lack of faith in Michael Pittman. I just wanted to touch on that as we get into these middle rounds and who you're maybe targeting. And then if you see a Pittman or a, Marquise Brown slipping wide receiver 35, wide receiver 40, jump on the talent. Jahan Dotson, speaking of talent.
Oh,
kind of under the radar with Garrett Wilson and Chris Olave kind of grabbing the rookie headlines. And he missed some time with injury. So he finished wide receiver 50. So the guys that just, draft off of last season's success aren't going to really notice him. Wide receiver 39 on a points per game basis. So getting into that wide receiver 3 tier. He has a wide receiver 36 ADP. So that's kind of, that's, but he was 22nd in your one number rankings. What do you think of Dotson?
Yeah, I'm kind of right in line consensus on Dotson, maybe a little bit higher because I really like the player, like you mentioned. And I liked him as a prospect too. I'm not sure if we talked about it on the show last year, but I like Jahan Dotson as a prospect. But even the way that I liked him, like I expected him to be sort of like almost like a Doug Baldwin, Tyler Lockett, not even maybe Tyler Lockett, but I thought he would be more like Doug Baldwin than Tyler Lockett in the sense that he was going to be like a vertical slot receiver, but pretty similar to like Tyler Lockett. He comes in his first year and he was awesome on the outside. From the game sampled, he was outside on 69.9% of his sampled route or sampled snaps. And he had an 87th percentile success rate versus press. I didn't see that part of it coming. The fact that he was so good against press coverage on the outside, so good against man coverage, and was still very good against zone coverage as well. And you look at his route success rate chart, great on vertical routes, and really those routes too where he has to break back to the quarterback in man coverage, like comebacks, curls. He was one of the best receivers sampled last year on comeback routes. Very impressive stuff for a rookie receiver who we also know is weirdly good in contested situations for his size. He's a great 50-50 ball player. I think him and McLaurin are an awesome duo. I still like Curtis Samuel a lot too. Sam Howell's good. Like this Washington offense is set to fly. I really like these guys, and I think you can be in on Jahan Dotson and still be in on Terry McLaurin this year. I think those two guys are going in really comfortable ranges of the draft.
Yeah, I think there's just a lot of folks sleeping on this offense because of Howell and the quarterback changes, and perhaps Jacoby Brissett as the backup. They feel like Howell's not secure in his job or whatever, but I think this is a great reason to draft Howell as QB2 or QB3 in your super flex draft. So he's got a great receiving core.
Look, it's Washington. I get it. And it's Jahan Dotson, who's like a smaller route running guy, but he made big plays downfield. Like that's what people are like. Oh, he's just a route runner or whatever. Go back and watch the highlights for Jahan Dotson last year. Like big plays down the field, making people miss in the open field, winning in tight coverage. Like he's a better football player, or at least he was a better football player as a rookie than Christian Watson, than George Pickens, than Treylon Burks. Like these big receivers that people like. Everybody's still so receiver sizist. And I'm not saying I'm all out on all three of those guys. To varying degrees, I have my concerns with each of them a little bit, but I'm still generally okay with Watson and Pickens. But like, I just don't get it. I think Dotson showed you everything you'd need to see from like a potential, I'm not saying star quality, but a really good starting receiver that I think can take even another step this year. So I like him better than all those three players as a real life football player. I'm not saying I'm ranking him ahead of Christian Watson or anything, who goes much higher, but man, Dotson's rookie season, one of the most underrated, I think, of the last few years.
And I think that's due to injury. So let me just run through what I saw when I looked at his game logs. Through the first 4 weeks prior to the hamstring injury, he was the fantasy wide receiver 21 with 12 catches for 152 yards and 4 touchdowns. He returned in week 10. He didn't get to starter snaps, though, until week 13. At that point, he rattled off 5 for 54 and a touchdown, 4 for 105 and a touchdown, 6 for 76 and a touchdown, 3 for 37, and 3 for 72. He averaged 9.4 fantasy points on the season, but when the 3 limited games are removed, he averaged 3.7 catches, 55 yards, 0.78 touchdowns, or 12.1 fantasy points per game. Those are solid wide receiver 2 numbers, easily fantasy starter numbers. And that's his upside if he's able to stay healthy in this offense.
And I think by hook or by crook, shout out to ODU's finest, Taylor Heineke, but I think they're going to get better quarterback play one way or another this year. I mean, Heineke, he was an XFL backup quarterback before coming to Washington, so I don't know.
Yeah, I'm just hoping that Pittman doesn't go the way of McLaurin here with this continued sketchy quarterback plays, but we'll see.
I think you could argue that Pittman, for all for the guys that I've loved, like Allen Robinson, for like Terry McLaurin, these guys get stuck with bad quarterbacks. The guys that Michael Pittman has had thrown him the ball the last years, like, aren't even in the league. Like Carson Wentz is posting photos of himself in all 3 of his old jerseys. I mean, Matt Ryan is doing games for CBS. Jacob Eason is not in the league anymore. That's a real person who's thrown Michael Pittman a pass. And like Sam Ehlinger he's still in the league, but he's the 3rd quarterback for the Colts now.
It's tough. It's tough out there if you're Michael Pittman backer, but we'll see. I think maybe Anthony Richardson will be a little bit better than people expect, especially downfield. Yeah. Another middle round guy that's just kind of forgotten, wide receiver, not forgotten, but a lot of people love Brandon Aiyuk. But his ADP is wide receiver 29. He finished fantasy wide receiver 15 last year. He was wide receiver 23 in points per game. Now, he did benefit from some Deebo Samuel injuries there. There's definitely been some splits issues when Deebo is healthy. In your route running, though, your charting, he went from 19 last year in the 1-number rankings to number 12. So he's continuing to hone his craft and get better at the route running aspect of it. I think there's a lot of upside here if there's either a Deebo injury or a Kittle injury, or if we to believe Kyle Juszczyk, that he just looks different and might be the featured pass catcher this year. What do you think?
Yeah, I think there's upside with both of those paths. Like you said, I think everybody knows, like, look, if Deebo gets hurt or Kittle gets hurt or McCaffrey gets hurt, all 3 of those guys have dealt with injury issues in the past. Knock on wood, Aiyuk has been the most healthy of the 3 over the course of their NFL careers. I think, like, that's obviously the upside path, but there is an upside scenario where he just is so much better than everybody else. And those guys are all really good players too, by the way. Deebo is one of the best zone beating receivers in the league. He's one of the most unique receivers in the league. Kittle's a great tight end. And obviously McCaffrey is a star pass catcher. But this offense, I think to this day, we get caught up in like the gadgety stuff, the gadget receivers and all the pizzazz and whatever. But this offense is still best when they have like a number 1 alpha receiver that can line up at the X and can beat press man coverage. Think about Kyle Shanahan's offenses back in Houston with the Texans, with Andre Johnson, even like Pierre Garçon when they had, and I mean, we're talking about Pierre Garçon. Like Pierre Garçon, there was a couple years in Washington. I mean, Julio Jones with the Atlanta Falcons. And like Brandon Aiyuk is on that trajectory right now. 91st success rate against man, 91st percentile success rate versus man coverage, 79.3% success rate versus press. Like the guys that are 79% against press, they all become like superstars basically, unless you're Terry McLaurin and you're stuck with bad quarterback play. So I think Aiyuk is just on that rocket ship trajectory up. And if this is the year, I want to be drafting him. If it's next year, I want to be the year drafting him. Like, at some point, he's going to have that Stephon Diggs leap where we're sitting here on this show talking about his success rates. Like, these are some of the best numbers in the league, but then the situation catches up. And man, then we're talking about one of the best and most productive receivers in the league. Yeah.
If we get him 140 targets instead of 114 targets, it's a game changer for him. I just don't know. Like they're manufacturing touches for Deebo. They're manufacturing touches for McCaffrey. I mean, maybe the answer to this is Brock Purdy. I mean, with all this talent in this offense, it's tough. It's tough but at the same time, you see him there, 7th round, 6th, 7th round. He has the talent. These are the guys we want to bet on. You just can't. I think fantasy managers have a tendency to assume full health for a player's teammates as they're looking at the player's ADP and saying, oh, well, he doesn't do it when Deebo and Kittle are healthy, so I can't draft him. But you can't assume full health. So you got to take that into account, the chances of some injury there for him to explode, and then also just the talent level for him to make a leap. Should we be worried? Jerry Jeudy finished wide receiver 26 last year, fantasy-wise. He's a wide receiver 21 ADP, so fantasy managers are thinking he's going to improve. He didn't do great in your charting, as far as I can tell. Number 41 in the 1-number rankings. he also has, and normally you see this, and I go look at the contested catch rate, and it's like, oh, he's fine. He catches 80% of his contested catches, but he had a poor contested catch rate too. So what do we do with Jeudy?
We're not drafting him at wide receiver 21. That's what we're not going to do. And I don't dislike Jerry Jeudy as a player. I think what has happened with Jerry Jeudy is he came into the NFL with a reputation of being a big time route runner. Like that. That's normally a pretty good indicator, but we've seen him decline the last 2 years, really in his second season, but he had the high ankle sprain. And then last year he's at like a 70.6% success rate versus man, which is, it's okay. It's good. It's actually 63rd percentile. It's a good number, but it's not where I think people imagine him to be. The real troubling stuff is 68.4% success rate versus zone coverage. That's a 5th percentile score in reception perception history. And I think, again, the consistency is not there as a route runner. The consistent technique is not there as a route runner. I think he still gets overrated based on flash plays and like clips of him doing this at practice. I mean, like that, he's one of those guys that like you see the routes in practice and they go crazy on Twitter and stuff like that. But in games, the consistency is not there. And I realize he finished over if you isolate just those last 6 games, he was really good, right? Well, 2 problems there. One, Courtland Sutton's banged up during a little bit of that time. Sutton is not a good player. I mean, he's not a great player, but he's like an average starting X receiver. People were overrating him last year. They were too excited about him last year. I'm sure I came on the show and talked about that with Courtland Sutton, but he's not garbage. He's not nothing. Like, he's going to be out there commanding about 100 targets or something like that. I like Greg Dulcich as a tight end. Marvin Mims is a good player they traded up for. I just don't think that the separation between Jeudy and everybody else is really deserved in this Broncos offense when we still have questions about the quarterback play. And I think we should have questions about the player. And the last thing I'll say about the production and stuff like that, the last 6 weeks, like the offense was still not good. That's a problem too. Is like, okay, he was producing in this offense. I get it, but the offense stunk. Like, why does the offense continue to run through Jerry Jeudy if the offense is not good? So I have my issues with just how people are viewing Jeudy. I don't think he's a bad player. I just think he's like a number 2 receiver on a roster full of what I think is probably a bunch of number 2 receivers.
Yeah, he's being drafted 5 spots ahead of his finish last year. I do think that the offense is going to be better there with Sean Payton running things. I think that Russell Wilson can bounce back and have a much better season, but that doesn't necessarily mean that Jerry Jeudy is going to finish better than he did last year. If Courtland Sutton, Marvin Mims, Greg Dulcich all break out or do better. They also have Samaje Perine catching passes and Javonte Williams as well. So I'm a little bit worried about Jerry Jeudy given your charting there at reception perception. And I think the one number rankings take into account the man routes, the zone routes, and they weight them based on how many routes they're running. So if he did that poorly against zone, that's why he is where he's at in the one number rankings.
Yeah, 61.1% of his routes are against zone coverage. So,
and defenses typically are playing zone, so that's a problem. All right, Michael Thomas. Now I see him in the 9th round sometimes, and I'm thinking, Michael Thomas. This is a really good player. Oh man, what if he's Michael Thomas? Like, what if he's back? And I read your write-up. It wasn't very encouraging. He has a wide receiver 42 ADP. He's number 39 in the one number rankings, which is way low for him. I mean, he used to be a stalwart in the top 10. So you could talk a little bit about what you saw. How much do you think of it is rust injury? Do you think that he could bounce back and, get, into the mid 20s and get back to where we're, maybe not top 10, but getting really into a more serviceable route runner than he was last year? The contested catch rate was great at least. So if you can't separate, it's great to be able to catch the contested passes. What'd you see with Thomas?
Yeah, I mean, number one, it's only a 3-game sample size, so obviously we got to keep that in mind. It's smaller than we normally want, but in those 3 games, I think the ability to separate against man and zone coverage was severely lower than what we've. I mean, this is a guy who, like you said, not only has he been a stalwart in the top 10 of the one number rankings, his 82.2% success rate versus zone cover or man coverage and 89.3% success rate versus zone in 2018 the year before he broke the catch record. That success rate versus man is still the second best in the RP database. The zone success rate is still the seventh best in the RP database. Like, there's a player who, used to be the best of the best in terms of getting open. And I definitely did not see that last year. Obviously, you mentioned the contested catch rate stuff. I think he will still be a very valuable player in like tight coverage and 50-50 ball situations. But you got to be concerned about that ability to separate and where he is. And to your point about like, what is he going to be this year? I have no idea, right? Like, is it rust? Has he lost a step after so many complicated lower body injuries? I mean, this guy's not even like in the same stratosphere, but you look at you look at DJ Chark's like 2019 reception perception, and then you look at what he's put out the last 2 years, and you think about the number of ankle injuries that guy's dealt with in that time, you can kind of understand why there's been that steep decline. And for Thomas, I'm concerned we're kind of in that same zone, and you might just never get that groove back. I'm okay with, like, look, he goes so late, like you said, 9th round. Who cares if you swing and miss on that pick? I kind of almost want him to be out there just because I want there to be more credible threats in the Saints offense so that people can't like really key in on Chris Olave, because Chris Olave is the guy I want to draft on this team this year.
Yeah, looking at Thomas's ADP wide receiver 42, he's going around Treylon Burks, who I know I could safely say you're not a big fan of his. Kadarius Toney, very high yards per route run, kind of a gadget player at this point.
Yeah, extremely skeptical.
Cortland Sutton, Quentin Johnson, Odell Beckham, and Zay Flowers, who are intriguing. But I did see Rashad Bateman came back to practice today, so I'm wondering how that the snaps there are going to shake out. I mean, if we see Odell Beckham and Zay Flowers in 80-90% snap roll, then in a pass heavier offense, that's great. So I'm just kind of looking at Thomas versus some of these guys and whether or not I'd want to pull a trigger. And the one thing I'd mention on Thomas is that even though the 3 games that you charted, he didn't fare particularly well in terms of his success rates. He still posted 5 for 57 and 2 touchdowns on 8 targets, 6 for 65 and a touchdown on 9 targets, and then 5 for 49, only playing 68% of the snaps. So I think he went down with injury late in that game. So still was productive, even though the route running wasn't as sharp, separation wasn't as good as previous years. So still might be worth the roll of the dice there if he's, healthy and active in camp.
You mentioned the contested catch rate. He saw a contested target on 39.1% of his sampled routes from weeks 1 to 3 in this sample here. 88.9% contested catch rate. Like, he's still got great hands in tight coverage. I kind of wonder if we might see him be more of a slot receiver, like a big slot receiver type. That was where people thought he was going to play coming into the league in like that old Marcus Colston role for the Saints, but he actually was like a big X receiver when we were talking about some of those great years for him. So I think a role change and the fact that he's still got great hands, those are the stories that you would have to tell yourself. Because obviously, again, the separation, he was still pretty good against press coverage. It's just like the ability to separate downfield is going to be a concern for Michael Thomas at this point.
And maybe they won't ask him to do that as much as they maybe had in the past, given the fact that they have Rashid Shaheed and Chris Olave, who's obviously the stud there in that offense. Rookie roundup section. Speaking of Chris Olave, number 9 in the 1 number rankings. Garrett Wilson, number 18. Christian Watson, number 34, with a pretty good contested catch rate. As a Packer fan, I'm rooting for Christian Watson. He is the thing that stands out about him. He's the fastest player on the field whenever he's on the field, it seems. So if they can get him the ball and in motion, he is ridiculously quick. He can just burn by people, and that kind of and if he can, catch the ball contested, that kind of overcomes some of these somewhat mediocre numbers. But I think even for maybe you weren't expecting him to be a killer route runner in his first year, finishing 34th in the 1 number rankings, which I know you don't really look at, but it kind of sums up what you've seen. That's not too bad. He's got some potential there as a number 1.
Yeah, he doesn't. He's a good player. I mean, for sure, he is a good player. 34th, I think, is actually really a fair ranking for Christian Watson because he's not in the same tier. I don't care what his like yards per route run or any of that stuff says. He's not in the same tier as like Chris Olave and Garrett Wilson. But I think that would be a really unfair like expectation to put on him. But when you look at him, like his strengths are so strong. Coming to the NFL, I compared him to Martavis Bryant, and I still think that's like a great comparison for him because, man, Christian Watson can beat you over the top. You look at his post route, 9 route, corner route, and deep out route success rate. Those are all really good for on the route tree. Those are 4 great routes for him. He's also good at getting separation on these like quick flat routes, 88.2% success rate on flat routes, mostly just leaking out against zone coverage there. And then, man, he's freaky after the catch, much like Martavis Bryant. He could beat you down the field, but he could really kill you in the open field as well. And that's where Christian Watson, I think, really shines. So, is he ever going to be a true number 1 receiver, like a big time alpha? I think then he's going to have to improve on like base NFL routes, like curls and slants and digs and stuff like that. But right now, like he's going to make plays in key areas. So I've been like kind of in line with ADP and in line with like expectations for Christian Watson this year, accounting for the fact that we don't know the quarterback. We don't know what that's going to be like. This offense is so young. How much are they going to throw the ball? So I don't want people to read reception perception and think like, oh, we're all out on Christian Watson. I actually think your 1 number ranking for him is really fair.
Yeah, and I think when I saw it, I was like, oh, he wasn't a total dud. He wasn't in the bottom 10. Well, that's when I get worried is when I see him, in the bottom 10 in the 1 number rankings. I'm like, oh boy, this is gonna be rough. But because
who's
those
in
players,
the bottom 10 this year?
Oh, all right, let me pull it up. I hate to call out names sometimes, but the bottom 10.
You can just send it to me.
Okay, I'll just. Let's just say the player you meant. I will send it to you, but the bottom player is DJ Chark. So
yeah,
it kind of sums up where we're at. Chris Olave, we touched on him. I think he's a little underrated somehow because he didn't win Rookie of the Year. Garrett Wilson won that, but he had a higher catch rate. He finished with higher yards per route run, elite level 2.42, 6th highest mark last season. And there has been for both these guys, Garrett Wilson and Chris Olave. I don't know if there's any worries on your end with them. They both had quarterback changes, and in theory, they're both upgrades. I think we're safe to say the Jets one is an upgrade. I think we're fairly, Derek Carr, I think the book's in on him. He's probably better than Andy Dalton at this point, Jameis Winston. But there's sometimes some, when Kenny Pickett came in, he and Deontay Johnson just didn't jive very well. Yards per attempt to Deontay was very low compared to George Pickens, very high. So sometimes there's some weird stuff that happens with quarterbacks and receivers. Are you, any concerns with Chris Olave or Garrett Wilson where they're going in drafts?
No, I think Garrett Wilson, number 1, starting with him, like it's deserved for Garrett Wilson to be going that high. And number 1, I think where the routes where Christian Watson wasn't great last year, those base NFL routes, like going over the middle of the field, those were the routes that Garrett Wilson was really good on. So I actually think in a weird way, not only will Aaron Rodgers bring out the best of Garrett Wilson, which I think is obvious and I think we're hoping for, I think that Garrett Wilson and where he wins will bring out the best of Aaron Rodgers too there in New York. And really the best indicator in Garrett Wilson's rookie profile, which is awesome, and I think he's on a superstar trajectory. Garrett Wilson had an 81.2% success rate versus press coverage. That's at the 94th percentile in RP history. John, the following players in their rookie season have hit 80% success rate versus press: CeeDee Lamb, Michael Thomas, Tyreek Hill, Jamar Chase, Justin Jefferson, and Odell Beckham, and now Garrett Wilson. So pretty good list. Pretty good list to be on.
That's good company. Really good company.
That is good.
Yeah. Yeah, I think they're both going. Yeah, I mean, Garrett Wilson's going 2nd round, Chris Olave early 3rd round, late 2nd round. I think those are fair ADPs for those players.
And for Chris Olave, like you mentioned, his because he's not the same yak guy that Garrett Wilson is. Garrett Wilson's like if Kadarius Toney could actually run routes, he'd be Garrett Wilson. Like that's how good Garrett Wilson can be in the open field. With Chris Olave, it's a little more subtle, but if you look at his route percentage chart, number 1, the success rates are great. Like you mentioned, Olave's up there in the 1 number rankings, 75.8% success rate versus man, just shy of that 80% mark against press coverage. So he didn't quite get in that group that Garrett Wilson did. But I mean, he's got those high success rates, and 7.4% of his routes were slants. Like 7.4% of his routes, like, there's no layup routes for Chris Olave. It's all like intermediate and vertical stuff. I think that's where we talk about Derek Carr coming in there, because those routes that Derek Carr and Devontae Adams were absolute money on last year, like dig routes, out routes in the intermediate area, Chris Olave's got a ton of experience running those routes. So I think they will click in that area. And I know that a lot of like Andy Dalton's efficiency metrics look good last year. I think that's because he's thrown to a guy that was always open in Chris Olave. Now Derek Carr will get to do it too.
It's funny how quarterbacks like players that are always open.
Yeah,
they like to throw to them. Let's do a live sleepers question mark section here, and I'm wondering if we like these players, what we think's going to happen with them this year. The three guys that jumped out to me in terms of their ADP and possible role: Sky Moore. Sky Moore was a reception perception favorite coming out of college. I would say everybody would agree that his rookie year was a disappointment. He had a good contested catch rate, but he was 22 catches for 250 yards and no touchdowns on 33 targets, only played 28% of the snaps in a offense that sort of needed receivers to step up and didn't. He didn't, or at least the Chiefs didn't want him to or feel he could. He had a solid 1.50 yards per route run, which is 49th out of 115 eligible receivers with at least 30 targets. Can he make the leap? It sounds like he's going to be a starter there. What do you? I mean, he could be like one of these post-hype sleepers.
Yeah, to me, he absolutely is. I mean, I understand why people are upset about Sky Moore not playing a ton, right? But like, think about this guy's coming from like Western Michigan, really low level of competition, and he's going to Andy Reid's offense. I've compared that to like, John, if you moved to a foreign country, you had to learn the currency, you had to learn the new language, you had to learn to drive on the other side of the street. That's a huge transition. Not to mention, this is where like going beyond WR next to their name is so important, because whose job is Sky Moore supposed to take on that team last year? He's not taking MVS's job. By the way, MVS is like fine. He's fine in playing his role, right? He's not taking that job. The job that Sky Moore is ticketed for is like a flanker slot receiver. Well, Juju's playing in that role last year. And Juju, people, think he stinks now. He was overrated back in like 2018 or whatever, but he's like a fine NFL veteran who's kind of doing his job, right? So I think you look at Sky Moore going into that role this year with his ability to win on slants, on flat routes, on curl routes, and dig routes, like the short and intermediate stuff. He could really pile up targets in that role. His rookie season, is not too bad when you look at the fact that he was playing at a limited, really limited and lower level in college and transitioning to be an NFL player. And I wrote about this in his RP profile. People should just go check it out. Like talking about how they had him kind of play all different positions and just get his feet wet and get him acclimated to the NFL game. I think they're counting on him to be a starter this year, and I think he can play well in that role.
That's good to hear. Was one of those situations where we got excited about a player, and I think it's sort of the similar thing maybe with Christian Watson coming from that lower level, having to learn all that, learn the NFL level. You're almost jumping 2 levels as opposed to just going from big college to the NFL. So he's certainly going to play a lot more this year. Isaiah Hodgins, wide receiver, 68 ADP. I just want to mention Sky Moore was number 29 in the one number ranking, so not bad for a rookie. Isaiah Hodgins, number 35 in the one number rankings. Another great contested catch rate from week 13 through the divisional round, a 7-game span, which is a decent size sample. Hodgins caught 34 or 44 targets, 358 yards, 51 yards per game, and 5 touchdowns. He also had a 1.50 yards per route run. People seem to be sleeping on Hodgins, but they're not picking anyone in this receiving core other than Darren Waller. What are your thoughts on Hodgins?
Hodgins, I think, stands out in this group because he's the one guy that I think can play the X receiver position. Outside on 83.4% of his sample snaps, was on the line for 81.4%. They did some creative stuff with him in that Vikings game when they had him in the playoff game where they had him running like choice routes from the slot. That was pretty cool to see. So it's a little bit speaking to his versatility, but I think he's the one guy who can play on the perimeter and play on the line of scrimmage. Darius Slayton's more of a speed flanker type. Jalen Hyatt is probably a speed flanker type when he's ready to roll, and they have a bunch of slot receivers, right? So I think Hodgins stands out there. His ability to beat press coverage, 77.8%, was really impressive in the game sampled for him. So I've actually been taking a lot of Isaiah Hodgins late in drafts because I think he showed he could actually play last year, and is a guy that can play that X receiver position for a team that really needs it.
Yeah, as a wide receiver 5, wide receiver 6, pretty free at the end of drafts. It just seems like he's going to play 80-90% of the snaps unless he somehow loses that job. I don't see him doing that.
Yeah.
Nico Collins, Wide receiver 57, number 33 in the one number rankings. Another great contested catch rate guy. Averaged 48 yards and 0.2 touchdowns on 6.6 targets per game last year. Was wide receiver 53 on a per game basis. 1.63 yards per route run. I'm wondering, with Brandon Cooks gone, I think we have Tank Dell. We're going to talk a little bit about Tank Dell a little bit later. We got a few more minutes of the podcast, so I want to talk to you about the rookies. But Nico Collins, what do you think his upside is if if he's getting 8-9 targets a game?
I like Nico Collins a lot. He's been like my favorite double-digit round receiver just because, again, the only guy on that offense that's going to play the X receiver position. And like I mentioned about the 49ers and Brandon Aiyuk, that offense is typically the best when it has itself like a real X receiver who could beat press man coverage on the outside. 74th percentile success rate versus press for Nico Collins, 71% against man coverage. Not elite numbers by any means, but I think better than people would imagine. And he's shown an ability to like separate and like sink his hips working over the middle too, in addition to being a downfield threat. I think Nico Collins is, again, probably the best breakout bet. I don't know what's his ceiling with the rookie quarterback, but if guys that are going in the late rounds, like the double-digit rounds like that can be like a functional flex play, and I think can have a breakout NFL season, it's definitely Nico Collins. I'm a fan of his. I don't want to say I'm like all in on him or anything, but I think in terms of being like a poor man's T. Higgins type of player, he could be that guy.
Yeah, and maybe you get 800 or 900 yards and 6 or 8 touchdowns. And CJ Stroud might be better. I've looked at some stats of his, man. Stroud comes in with some good metrics in terms of being a rookie passer. So we'll see. Last thing I want to discuss with you, Matt, if you have a few more minutes, is prospect charting. And you've kind of rolled this out over the last 2 years. I dug into the numbers a little bit yesterday. Yesterday was my prep for Matt Harmon day at work. So I wanted to mention a few things that I found. I think you find these things interesting as well. But from 21 to 2022, 7 of the 8 rookies that had a 78% success rate or better in their college charting scored at least 8 fantasy points per game as rookies. That's half PPR. That doesn't sound very impressive to the PPR folks, but we work in half PPR right now at 4-for-4. The only exception was Sky Moore, who we discussed, and maybe why that was. Drake London averaged 8.0 half PPR points per game, and he was a fantasy wide receiver 38. That group of 8 rookies averaged 9.1 points per game as a whole, which is about what Curtis Samuel averages last year's wide receiver 27. The 4 players who had a success rate of 80% or more over the last 2 seasons, and I'm talking about Devonta Smith, Elijah Moore, Jalen Waddle, and Chris Olave, they averaged 10.7 points per game. That's more than what DJ Moore averaged as the wide receiver 19. So what I'm getting at is that Matt's college charting is also useful to know, when they come in, what's their route running, how good are they as route runners coming out of college, and what does that lead to in terms of fantasy. And we can get starter numbers out of these guys. And it seems like the 78% success rate is the measure in terms of having that immediate impact. Now, there's some guys that are, Jamar Chase, I don't think hit that number, and he did fine. But, this is a 7 out of 8 group where they produce the fantasy starter type numbers. That's super helpful, when we're trying to project these rookies.
Yeah, and it is. I'll have you write that one down for me, right? Put it on the test.
That was a lot, wasn't
it? But yeah, no, I think a guy like Jamar Chase is interesting because he came into the league like playing real NFL X receiver as a collegiate player, which I think is why his success rates were not low by any means, but lower than some of those other players. So I think there are a lot of interesting impact players from this year's class. I don't know that any of these guys are as good as like Jamar Chase or Devonta Smith coming into the NFL, even like a Jalen Waddle type. But I think Jackson Smith-Njigba was interesting, right? 75% success rate versus man, 83 against press coverage. And he's a guy that's primarily going to line up in the slot. His ability to beat zone coverage is obviously really good. I like him. The 2 guys I think are good for those like late season bets are like Zay Flowers and Quentin Johnston. Like, can they come on late in the year when this passing offense has really clicked? I really like them a lot. And then like, to bring it back to your Packers, buddy, Jaden Reed, big fan of Jaden Reed, 70.3% success rate versus man, and 77, second in the class, only to Jackson Smith-Njigba, 77.8% success rate versus press coverage. And he's probably going to line up in the slot a ton too. I really like Jaden Reed as a sleeper this year for sure.
And Romeo Dobbs did not do particularly well in the no one number rankings. He's one of the aforementioned bottom 10. I think there's opportunity for Jayden Reed. I did want to mention the two rookies who did surpass the 78% threshold, but not the 80% threshold are Smith and Jigba and Josh Downs, interestingly, third round pick for the Colts. Zay Flowers came in very close, 77.7% overall success rate weighted based on your charting. So, Flowers is certainly interesting with what's going on with in Baltimore. Downs, I don't know what to make of that. Given that receiving core, he might fit well there, but with Alec Pierce and Michael Pittman, but the volume of that offense isn't going to be there to support him. But maybe in a long-term, dynasty type format, he's somebody to consider.
We're just hoping Michael Pittman gets there this year. Let's save 24 and 25 for our year that we can start pushing Josh Downs propaganda, who I'm a huge Josh Downs fan.
All right, we won't spend much time on Josh Downs. Jayden Reed, you mentioned him. Two other players all came in over at 75%. So that's Jordan Addison, Jayden Reed, and Tank Dell came in over at 75%. Marvin Mims came in at 74.8%. Addison, Reed, and Dell do seem poised for starter type snaps, 70% or more. Addison seems like he could maybe be 90% type player. If he can take over all that Adam Thielen stuff. He had the weird speeding ticket, which I don't know what's going to happen with that, but it didn't show very good judgment. But he has a good, terrible defense there, and in Minnesota, a good quarterback throwing the ball, and could be a good pick there. But he's going quite a bit earlier. Tank Dell and Jayden Reed are going very, very late.
Yeah, Tank Dell, just the size stuff, obviously, right? But Jayden Reed, I do think, maybe behind Christian Watson, wide open Packers depth chart, I want to be at least tracking like how he's playing early on, because I think he's got the route running chops and the ability in contested situations. You got to a few more tweaks there, but he could be a starting level player and a potential pro ready guy right away. I think he's kind of like a discount version of Jordan Addison, honestly.
Yeah, I did see a highlight of him getting a manufactured touch on a reverse that he took to the house. Of course, nobody could tackle him, but he did run it all the way to the end zone.
Well,
I did hear, the Tank Dell stuff's interesting because I did hear that he has been very impressive, even though he's, tiny, right? So, just being kind of a short dump off option for Stroud there would, I think, make him a possibility in PPR formats where he's popping his head up for 4 for 40 in a given week. I
wonder who's going to play the slot between him and John Mechie, the second year receiver who missed his entire rookie year. Is which one of those guys is going to be out there more often? Because I think Robert Woods is probably ticketed into the flanker role, at least early on. Also, how many times is this team really going to get into 3 receiver sets? Because I think Nico Collins is locked into that X spot. Maybe Mechie takes over the flanker spot from Robert Woods at some point, and then Tank Dell is like that speed slot. I don't know. I do think Tank Dell is really interesting if and when he gets on the field.
We have one more question from the chat, and I'll let you go, Matt, from Alvaro Garcia. We can put it up here. It might be a dumb question. I'm going to just assume you said dumb there. How is Rashee Rice different from Sky? What role does Rice come into play? Is Rice a threat to Sky? And I will just say that Rice didn't do very well in your college charting.
No, he did not. But I was also told that he played almost that entire the specific sample I had with like a foot injury. So I do want to just I made that context note in like almost anything I wrote about him. But it's weird because watching him even, I know Brett Veach came out after the draft. It's like, we think this guy could be a slot receiver for us. I kind of think he profiles more as a big receiver on the outside. Like his best stuff was working deep down the field. I mean, the success rates aren't great, but I'm just talking about like watching him play. The stuff I think he had the most potential to grow in was like running vertical routes down the field. And I think, again, the success rates aren't there. The contested catch conversion rate's not there, but I think he had some skills to hone as a ball winner on the outside. That to me sounds a lot like what they like about MVS. Like, I wonder if Rashee Rice is MVS's replacement next season. So I don't really think he's a threat to Sky Moore from a role perspective, but I think maybe next year we could see Rashee Rice, who's another guy coming from a low level of competition into Andy Reid's offense. There was a lot of excitement about Sky Moore in training camp this time last year. That's why he never got pushed down to where he should have been from an ADP perspective. They've talked a lot about Rashee Rice and being excited about him, but like if MVS and Justin Watson are playing over him on the outside, like don't be surprised.
Yeah, Justin Watson still apparently starting. They have Justin Ross, who has been flashing and turning heads. I'm seeing video of him as well. They added Richie James for the slot role potentially, if Sky Moore can't handle it potentially. I don't know. So it's a deep core, at least of names that we recognize, but we're still trying to sort out who it's going to be. Who's going to be on the field. I think we know that MBS is going to be on the field. We obviously know Travis Kelce is going to be on the field, but I think after that, it's kind of up in the air. Kadarius Toney, with that injury, sort of set himself back. He was sort of getting interesting, at least from a yards per route run standpoint, even though he wasn't the greatest route runner. Anything you want to say about Toney?
No, he's a gadget player. Let me give you one more deep rookie name for the road. Michael Wilson, Arizona Cardinals. This guy, I looked at my rankings. I have him ranked 40 spots ahead of consensus this year because he's like the 116th ranked wide receiver. 116th ranked wide receiver heading into the season. I don't have a full profile on him, but I have him as a guy who is in the rookie roundup there on the site, like mini samples. I think he showed an ability to beat press man coverage as an X receiver. And John, think about the bros there in Arizona, right? It's like Marquise Brown, who we like, but is a small player. Rondale Moore, who I think is a slot-only gadget guy. And then Greg Dortch, who's a tiny slot receiver. There's only one guy in Arizona who could play that X receiver spot. Maybe it's Zach Pascal. I doubt it. I think it's going to end up being Michael Wilson in Arizona. So, look, I might be talking to you about the third target-getting guy for Colt McCoy's offense. But just keep a name on your radar.
I have heard the name before. I saw some buzz about him. And looking at that, I wanted to ask you about Rondale Moore. I don't know. Are you gonna chart him this year?
We'll see if I have time to.
Okay. So he actually did fairly well last year in the 1-number rankings. He was middle of the pack, which I thought was pretty good for a slot receiver. But maybe they are running Wilson, Brown, and Moore out there this year, and maybe it's not Colt McCoy. I'm keeping my fingers crossed for Kyler Murray still. Keeping a light on. All right. Thank you so much for your time, Matt. Appreciate it. We will definitely have you back on in July or August of next year, if not before that. Really appreciate your time. Sign up to his site, Reception Perception. Follow him at Yahoo Fantasy as well. And to end this, just like John Daigle does, be a little bit kinder than what's required. See you next time.